Hey y'all, I'm Mixupala. I'm doing this series on political terms and how and my personal way of using these terms. So this is a kind of video glossary. These are the terms that I'm going to be exploring in this political glossary series. Liberalism, conservatism, neoliberalism, socialism, communism, Marxism, capitalism, leftism, right wing, and the conservative left. So, yes, part of the reason for this glossary is to sort of give a background for some of my personal political views. And yeah, so I'm going to cover the idea of the conservative left in this video. But first I'm going to read a quote by Michael Oakeshott about from his essay on being conservative, to sort of give a background on this idea of conservatism. To be conservative, then, is to prefer the family to the unknown, to prefer the tried to the untried, fact to mystery, the actual to the possible, the limited to the unbound, the near to the distant, the sufficient to the superordinate, the convenient to the perfect, present laughter to utopian bliss. On being conservative, Michael Oakeshott. So basically you have a definition of conservative that isn't confined to one party or another. It's what Michael Oakeshott calls a disposition. So it's understandable that is a disposition, because it's not even an opinion. I'm not explaining a philosophy or an opinion or anything like that. I'm talking about where an allegiance to a party or to an opinion might come from. Something below those type of things, a disposition. So what's interesting about Michael Oakeshott's definition of conservative is that you can see how in a different context what Donald Trump does might not be considered conservative, or what the Republican Party does might not be considered conservative, because this definition of conservative, this conservative disposition, is something that exists apart from the context. It's actually more universal than being a Republican. Being a conservative as a disposition is something that can exist in any context, whereas being a Republican in the way that person could be a Republican in the United States cannot be transferred to even any other country. Waving an American flag doesn't mean the same thing in any other country than it does in America. And yet, you could go to that same country, wave your American flag, and you would still be a conservative, but you wouldn't be their conservative. You wouldn't be a conservative to that place, but that place has its own conservatives who might not share that opinions of an American conservative, but that person will share this disposition which Michael Oakeshott explains. For instance, even in the Soviet Union, you can find people who would be conservative would actually be, Soviet, and they would be talking about liberals the way that this specialized term often talks about liberals as capitalists. So in that place, a conservative could have been, both a socialist, a communist, and a Soviet, and a conservative. So I really like this definition of conservative, because it can sort of move between different contexts. But what I like to sort of introduce is a different idea, the idea of a conservative left wing. And I haven't really explained the difference between right wing and left wing, and there's going to be a video on those too. But I can say that the left wing is sort of a value or it's a belief that inequality is not necessarily perfect. It's not necessarily the way things ought to be, and so this is really interesting. This sort of combination between this left-wing idea that inequality is not the way things ought to be, and this idea that we don't want, one might not want to disrupt something. This is kind of, there is like a kind of disjunction between these two ideas, but I think that disjunction gives it interest, actually, because I think that there are actually, in this broad sense, political philosophies, individuals, even probably parties in some parts of the world, maybe even some of the parties here, not very many parties in the US, certainly a lot of, certainly in the arts or something, there are these people who have this kind of disposition that's sort of left wing, and on the other hand, conservative, and so people or groups that I would consider left-wing conservatives are some Quakers, anti-vaxxers, organic farmers, the Catholic social teaching, and maybe the Dalai Lama. So you can kind of see between these different examples this sort of tendency towards tradition, and while also seeing in nature a justification for equality, a justification in the sort of law of God or something, or in like the law of the Tao, a justification for equality, and so that sort of view that is like, whether it be statist or whether it be an anarchist form, irregardless, this view that God created and intended a kind of equality of value, or maybe even otherwise, maybe other forms of equality, but certainly for me, that each person is created equal in the image of God, as a sort of natural state. That view to me is both conservative and left wing. And this is sort of what I mean by conservative and left wing. And I think it's really interesting that a lot of I admire a lot of Catholic countries, because Catholicism has this tradition that is in some regards both conservative and left wing, and it's the Catholic social teaching. And I'll read this excerpt from Wikipedia. Catholic social teaching is that the Catholic doctrines on matters of human dignity and common good in society. The ideas address oppression, the role of the state, subsidiarity, social organization, concern for social justice, and issues of wealth distribution. Its foundations are widely considered to have been laid by Pope Leo the 13th, 1891, encyclical letter Rerum Novarum, which advocated economic distributism. Its roots can be traced to the writings of Catholic thinkers such as Thomas Aquinas and Augustine of Hippo, and is also derived from concepts present in the Bible and the culture of ancient Near East. This is another excerpt. Catholic social doctrine has also tried to find an equilibrium between aspects of human liberty, including the right to private property and subsidiarity, and concern for the whole society, including the weak and the poorest. So it is that this idea of a conservative left isn't something that I just thought of myself, but it actually exists. It is in human history. It's these Quakers, maybe it's Dorothy Day. It certainly is this Catholic social teaching, but it isn't necessarily just one of these things. All these things are sort of different. I know the Mennonites may be a little more decentralized, or the Amish almost anarchistic, whereas the Catholic social teaching is certainly not anarchism. But I think both of those could both be conservative left wing, of a state form or an anarchist form. I'm an Orthodox Christian, and there's examples of this sort of left-wing conservatism in the teachings of the church fathers in the Orthodox Church. Saint John Chrysostom has criticized even the idea of private property, in the sense that property belongs to God. That is certainly a conservative and certainly a left-wing idea, and certainly absent from the political discussion in this country and largely around the world in many ways, because our political situation is exported through media and through all sorts of different ways. But this idea of a conservative left has precedent. It's a real concept. It's not something I'm making up. It's a real concept that exists. And yet it really is metapolitics. We are talking about metapolitics. We're not talking about elections. We're not talking about political issues. We're not talking about this or that. We're talking about the principles or the concepts, or even, as Michael Oakeshott explains, the dispositions behind what could be a political platform. So that's what we need to be doing before we just jump in and just start throwing mud at each other. oh, this issue, that issue. Yes, all these issues are really important, but if you let the system itself, the political system, decide who's on what side, you really are going to be giving up a lot. And so we need to step back, talk about meta politics, talk about philosophy, talk about theology, talk about the principles that inform these ideas. And I'm going to get in later, talk about the difference between the left and the right, liberalism, the different forms of liberalism, and then put this idea of left-wing conservatism or conservative leftism into a larger context of the left and the right, conservative, liberal, all these things. So thank you for watching. Have a good night.